This bias treatment is going to be the French bias style. Again, bias can be used to finish off edges like a neckline or a sleeve opening or an armhole opening. It forms really well around curved edges because of the fabric being cut on the 45-degree angle of the grain of fabric. I don't have stretch this way or this way, but along this strip I do on that. Now the French bias pieces, you'll use a 6x8 back piece with a curved corner cut out, and then the bias strip, check your measurement, should be 2 inches with plenty of length to go around that curve. Now to set up our bias, French bias style, it's a wider piece than what you use on the single bias. And this one, we fold wrong sides together and match up our raw edges along this one edge, along here, and then press so that the crease line is centered down that. Be careful as you go pressing that you do not stretch it. You want it to remain to be 1 inch then on its fold. Okay. I find that I like or find this approach a little easier when working with bias. The only time I really use a single bias is if my bias fabric is going to be pretty thick. Otherwise, I like to use the double bias or the French bias because then my folded edge stays folded. I don't have to worry about that tucked under 1/4 of an inch that would be pressed on the single bias coming loose. Now then, over to the machine, and in this one, I'm going to sew it with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Oh, you probably want to see this. Okay, this one we're going to sew with 5/8 inch seam allowance. This is going to be how you're going to do your bias on the armholes in your dress. So we're going to go ahead and stitch here, 5/8 inch over here, and again, just worry about conforming this for about 1 inch ahead of your presser foot. It's too hard to try and conform it all the way around the curve prior to sewing. And don't pull to stretch it. Go ahead and let it ruffle up a little bit on this right hand side, and it will kind of feed itself as it goes through. Back stitch when you reach the end of the blue, then go ahead and free it. You can trim away some of the excess. You don't need to trim it all away just yet. Okay, now then, on this one, once you have stitched it in place, and you want to make sure that it's fairly consistent from your stitch line over to your fold line, now you can trim away your extra seam allowances. Just be careful that you don't cut your original seam. You want to get close but not too close. I am staying about between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch away. That's about 3/16 to be quite honest. Now we'll press this one around, and had I done that with a smaller seam allowance, I could have folded it to encase my seam allowances, much like the single bias is done. But this one, we're going to fold completely to the inside of the garment. So it'll give it a nice finished outer look with just a top stitch around the outer side. Okay, so we want to press that direction. Sorry, that got out of camera view. Now then, as I rolled this way to press, I'm going to look for just the smallest edge out here along this edge of my front fabric. In this case, mine is blue. Okay. And pressing on around my curve. One more here. And on down. I find if I pre-press these items, it's much easier to control underneath the sewing machine. In a factory setting, they probably would not take the time to do all the pressing. Okay, from here, I'm going to stitch near my folded edge, but I want to keep my consistency from my outer edge of my garment. That way, from the outside, I will always look very consistent, even if I'm a little bit in from my folded edge on the inside. The French bias works really nicely with your lighter weight fabrics because being that it's a double layer, it adds a little more substantiality to the opening here of the garment. Like I said, you can use it for neck hole openings and armhole openings. Now at this point, I can trim my bias down to match evenly with my sample piece. All of that out of the way, let's take a look at it. So this is the bias from the inside, and from the outside you wouldn't be able to tell that it's a bias finish, but you have the top stitching that stays a very consistent 1/4 of an inch away from the edge all the way around. Let's say that was an armhole. This is how you're going to finish off your armholes on your dress project for week 3. You couldn't just turn under a 1/4 of an inch on fabric because of the distance of a curve. By the time it folds in, it needs to be a much wider curve where the stitching would actually hold it. So you would wind up getting little tucks in there. That's why the bias works so nicely, and it almost even sort of shapes it to fit kind of over and around a 3-dimensional body. There we go. Go ahead and take a photograph of your French bias in this direction and this direction to turn in. Thank you.